South China Sea, October 26, 1971. The air was black glass. Wind howled through the open ramp of a CH-47B Chinook, its twin rotors slicing humid night into thunder. Inside, 10 men sat strapped to canvas seats, crew, cargo, and one 19-year-old gunner named Private First Class Thomas F. Green. He wasn't old enough to drink back home, but here he manned an M60 machine gun in the doorway of a 50-foot-long flying target. The Chinook's call sign, Warrior 143, its destination, Cam Ranh Bay. It would never arrive. Minutes after departure, radar contact vanished. The helicopter disappeared over open sea. 4 bodies were recovered in the days that followed. Thomas Green's was not among them. He was listed missing in action. One more name etched in silence. When Green's remains came home, his sister laid his photograph beside their parents' headstone. Both had died, never knowing the truth. The Defense POW-MIA accounting agency confirmed identification through mitochondrial DNA. It was the 1,063rd recovery from Vietnam since 1973. Forensic teams still work every year, in jungles, riverbeds, mountains, looking for the missing. Each mission is part science, part faith. They dig, not for closure, but for promise, that nobody, not even a 19-year-old gunner, will ever be forgotten. Before the war, helicopters were transport. In Vietnam, they became everything: taxis, ambulances, gunships, and shields. Door gunners were the war's youngest breed. Most were barely 20. They had no armor, no cockpit, and no cover. They rode the wind, feeding belts of 7.62 millimeters into M60s as tracer fire climbed toward them from the trees below. They called the Huey the sound of war. They called the Chinook the bus that never stopped moving. A gunner's job wasn't to shoot everything, it was to see everything, to spot muzzle flashes before they spoke, to count seconds between bursts and reloads, to scan the green jungle until your eyes saw movement that wasn't there. They learned to keep one hand on the trigger and one on their harness, because in a crash you had 1 second to unclip or die strapped to the wreck. Thomas Green was born in Arkansas in 1952. He worked on engines, loved motorcycles, and enlisted because he wanted to fly. His training at Fort Rucker lasted 12 weeks. He qualified as a crew chief's assistant, then volunteered for gunner duty. A slot that few asked for twice. He wrote home once, "They say the sky here never sleeps. You can hear it breathing at night." When his crew lifted off, he always rode the left door, the hot side, the one that faced incoming ground fire first. He never wore gloves, said he wanted to feel the vibration of the gun. The veterans called him Greenie. He laughed too loud, cursed too much, but never once froze under fire. On the night of October 26th, Warrior 143 lifted from Tuy Hoa Air Base, loaded with supplies and 10 men. It was a short hop, less than 30 minutes of flight time, but weather was turning. Visibility low, winds gusting off the coast. The last radio transmission came 3 minutes after takeoff. Routine, calm, then static, nothing else. When search aircraft reached the area, they found oil on the surface, then wreckage. No survivors. 4 bodies floated days later. The sea kept the rest. The Army listed them missing in action. Their families were told limited recovery possible. Thomas Green's parents refused to believe it. Helicopter gunners lived minute to minute. They slept in hammocks strung beneath rotor blades. They carved names into helmets. Some kept a bullet in their pocket, their luck round. They joked about dying so they wouldn't think about it. One pilot said, "You could tell a new gunner by how often he ducked." After 2 weeks, he stopped Green fit in fast. He'd swap food rations for extra belts. He tuned his M60 by ear. When others took smoke breaks, he cleaned the gun, humming to himself. The crew trusted him because he didn't panic. On one flight, their Chinook took ground fire near Pleiku. Rounds tore through the rear ramp. Green held his position and returned fire until the pilot banked away. He didn't brag about it. He just said, "Nobody touches my crew." The night of the crash, they were flying low over water to avoid radar. Lightning lit the horizon in silent bursts. At 1947 hours, the aircraft vanished from radar. A pilot from another unit recalled hearing a mayday, half a sentence, cut off mid-word. It was likely the last sound Green ever made. The crash zone was deep, rough, and unreachable. The Navy searched for 3 days before declaring it impossible. 10 men gone, no beacon, no signal, no bodies. Their families received telegrams. The words, "missing in action," became their new address. 1971. The average age of an American helicopter gunner was 19, the same age as the average infantryman killed in the field. They flew an average of 2 missions a day. Each sortie exposed them to small arms, RPGs, and heat-seeking missiles. The door gunners were paid $90 a month extra for hazardous duty. They called it blood money. One veteran said, "It wasn't courage. It was routine. You didn't think you'd live long enough to get scared." Green was one of them. A face in the photos, a kid with oil on his hands and dust in his hair. He didn't know that he'd be one of 5,000 aviation crewmen lost, or that his name would vanish into the ocean for half a century. Decades passed. Families of the missing never stopped writing letters. In 1988, divers found fragments of rotor blades near Nha Trang, possibly from a Chinook. In 2019, joint U.S.-Vietnamese recovery teams located remains near the coast. DNA confirmed in 2022, Thomas F. Green, U.S. Army. 51 years after the crash, he came home. His coffin was draped in a flag he hadn't seen since the day he enlisted. The news barely made national headlines. But for his family, it was everything. He never left his crew, his sister said. Now they've finally brought him back to them. There was an unspoken rule among helicopter crews. Nobody leaves the aircraft until everyone's out. Pilots repeated it, gunners lived by it. When a bird went down, they didn't think about orders, rank, or reason. They thought about their brothers strapped inside. In a Huey crash near Dak To, a gunner named Ray Mullins stayed behind to cut his pilot free. When the engine ignited, he shielded the man with his body. They both survived. When Warrior 143 hit the South China Sea, survivors later speculated, Thomas Green could have unbuckled and floated free. But the last radio blip sounded like the crew's intercom, Green's voice shouting over wind, "I'm still here." That phrase became his legend. Flying gunner duty was a paradox. You were terrified, and yet you craved the next flight. They called it rotor addiction. The moment the engine spooled up, fear dissolved into vibration, noise, and rhythm. The world outside blurred, a rolling ocean of green and dust. The gunners watched tracers crawl toward them like fireflies. They aimed, fired, and prayed the next one wouldn't find them. Most smoked between flights. Some wrote letters they never sent. Others wrote one last note and kept it taped inside their helmet, just in case the day ended the way it usually did. Fast. The youngest of them were 19, same as Green, same as 2,500 others who never made it back. The recovery of Warrior 143 began with a piece of metal. In 2019, Vietnamese fishermen found a curved aluminum section half buried near the coast. The serial number matched a Chinook lost in 1971. Joint U.S.-Vietnamese teams worked in monsoon rain, sifting silt by hand. They found fragments of flight gear, then a dog tag, then a bone the size of a fingertip. That was enough. DNA confirmed Thomas F. Green, 68th Aviation Company. In April 2022, his remains arrived at Dover Air Force Base. 6 soldiers carried the casket onto Arkansas soil, 51 years late, but on time for eternity. Every helicopter company kept a tradition, the empty chair. A seat left unclaimed, painted black, strapped with a pair of dog tags. It reminded the living who hadn't come back. Crews would salute it before boarding. Green's old unit, the 68th, flew one final ceremonial sortie in 2023. On board, an empty seat with his name stenciled in white. They flew the same route from Tuy Hoa to Cam Ranh, dropped a wreath over the sea and circled once in silence. The pilot said later, "We always figured he stayed to the end. That's what door gunners did." In Vietnam, helicopter crews developed a bond unlike any other branch. They lived between worlds, not infantry, not Air Force. They were sky infantry. When they weren't flying, they repaired rotors, scrubbed hydraulic leaks, told jokes over bad coffee. When one was shot down, others marked their names on helmets, never in mourning, always as reminders. "If my bird goes down, don't wait for me," they'd say, "but don't forget me either." They never did. Every door gunner's story became part of every other's. The Huey's rotor thump became the heartbeat of Vietnam. Soldiers on the ground said they could hear salvation before they saw it. Pilots called it God's drumbeat. For gunners like Green, it was more personal. That rhythm was the pulse of friendship, duty, and death in the same breath. When the war ended, many veterans said the hardest part wasn't leaving Vietnam. It was leaving that sound behind. "The Huey was the only thing that never betrayed us," one said. "Everything else changed. The Huey came back for you." The helicopter changed the way wars were fought. Mobility replaced trenches. Speed replaced defense. The gunners, though, were constant. In every conflict since, Iraq, Afghanistan, door gunners still sit with legs hanging over nothing, trusting the sky to hold. They wear better armor now, better helmets, better odds, but they still whisper the same line before liftoff. Nobody leaves the aircraft until everyone's out. That's the line Thomas Green lived by and died by. At 19, he became part of the ocean. At 70, he came home wrapped in a flag. The wind that carried his last flight still moves over the same water. If you listen close, you can almost hear it. The low thunder of rotors fading into silence. That's not just noise, that's a heartbeat, and it belongs to every soldier who flew, fought, and refused to leave his crew.